So we've come to this final stage of composing our persuasive essay, and we've arrived at the car paragraph, which stands for counter argument and refutation. So the important aspect of finishing your persuasion with this type of structure is you're setting yourself up as a logical person. You're setting yourself up as someone who has taken the time to really think about the main point that you're writing about, and in particular, you're presenting a well-rounded argument. Um, so arguments are considered well-rounded when you've looked at both sides of the argument, not just presented evidence to support your core position or the position of your thesis statement. So this is what makes the car paragraph really tricky to write, because you're actually having to jump across the fence to the other side of the argument, and you're presenting some possible um, aspects of the story that don't necessarily support your core thesis. And that might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but the whole purpose for doing it is then for you to be able to bring in your refutation, that point where you show the other side of the argument, but then you kind of cut out the legs from underneath of it. So it is kind of tricky, because you kind of have to be mentally bouncing back and forth between the two sides of the argument. So anyways, let's give it a try. So we've already, you can see here, we've kind of set ourselves up nicely to jump into the beginning of our car paragraph by ending our solutions paragraph with a bit of wrap up and prediction. So although Santiago moves through problems, solutions, and benefits on his journey, it would be foolish to assume that all humans can replicate his success. In fact, within the story, there are many examples of humans who seem perfectly satisfied with simply settling for the gray days of a normal life. Okay, so we've set up what that opposite position is, which is just kind of moving through life in a normal way, not really striving after this great quest or goal, or trying to fulfill these huge ideas of like a personal legend. So now we have to both establish this, that this idea is credibly present in the story, and then we have to try to basically decimate the validity of that position. So it's a bit tricky, but let's give it a try anyways. So we kind of clearly state, we start with that clear topic sentence. Um, so Quello's alchemist is presenting the idea that trying to attain our personal legend is core to the storyline. So now, however, we have to kind of put out that counter argument side of things. Okay, so we've got Santiago's side of things, kind of throwing caution to the wind, quite literally, and pursuing your dream. But then there's the other side of the story here, which is that there are characters in the story who opt not to do that. So what we'll have to do now is to um, show those characters, provide citation support, analyze that, and then refute that. Okay. Okay, so also, of course, here we would want to include a citation. Let me just make sure my date is right. Yep. And I'm just going to put it that, again, as usual, I can go back into the novel and find the actual page. I'm not going to do that right now in the video because I want to try to be time efficient, but I can put a place marker in just like this. Okay, so notice again, we've got the past tense within the citation, and then we use the present tense within the analytical sentence that comes afterwards. So now we've made our first counter position, or our first opposition point, right? Which is up till here. That's the idea that people can live within the story, within the novel, who don't choose to be adventurers like Santiago does, right? Um, and I've used one of our vocabulary words here from our literary terms, is that this type of person would be considered a foil character. So the baker, right? He is put in opposition of Santiago, and we know that the baker wanted to travel, or at least that's what the King of Salem tells to Santiago. Um, and then we've come here with our analysis. This shows personal legends are not the only dominating force for characters in this novel. The baker is an important person in his village, and Santiago even feels somewhat jealous of the baker. As a settled and successful member of society, Santiago predicts that he will have an easier time finding a partner. So up until that point, what I'm doing is I'm establishing the position of opposition, okay, or the counter argument point. So now I've got to actually refute that. And sometimes it takes a second. You gotta, if you're writing a paragraph like this, or writing this section of an essay, be patient with yourself too. And if you're struggling to kind of have that insight moment, just give it a second. Give yourself a second to think through the process. So how can I prove that this position is not actually the position that Coelho really wants his readers to take away as a valuable point? And I guess that really, if you think about it, it's the fact that Santiago puts his faith in his journey and ultimately gets everything that he's looking for. Me. Okay, so that essentially that big chunk up to there equals our first counterpoint. Now, our counter argument and refutation, the two go together, right? You have to establish that second side of the argument, then you have to undercut the validity of that position. Um, just make sure that you follow the steps what we're seeing here. Now, ultimately, um, we would want two counter arguments and refutations in this paragraph. But as a writer, you're going to have to kind of gauge how many words you've used so far in your essay overall, and whether or not it is you think that you've convincingly counter argued and refuted with enough strength that you're ready to move on to your conclusion. Also, you might not be able to come up with two counter arguments, and if that's the case, that's also acceptable. As long as you've got one in there, I will kind of take into account that you've done your best to work with this difficult structure. Now, of course, I'm going to give you a second one here, so let me just check my notes. This is another really good point to make, is that as we're reading, so one of the main strengths that you can do to kind of help yourself in this writing process is, as you're reading, make sure you're being active. So while I was reading the last 30% of the book, knowing that I was going to have to write these example paragraphs, I took notes quite diligently in a physical notebook, so that I would kind of have an idea of where the pages are that might help me with these later paragraphs. So I'm just checking my physical notebook right here in front of me.